Okay, welcome everyone. So a fellow walks into the doctor one day and he says to the doctor, he says, some mornings I wake up and I feel like a wigwam. The doctor's like, really? Then he says a couple days later, he says, I wake up and I feel like a teepee. So the doctor scratches his head and goes to his computer and probably does a Google search and writes a couple things down, and he comes back and he says, you're too tense. Okay, with that, I'd like to welcome my good friends to the stage. Craig from Newmont Mining, he's the global business process leader. Craig, if you'd like to join me. I need some help after that joke. And Bill Towsley, who spent 32 years at Suncor Energy, and I'd have to consider a thought leader in this space. And now Bill is out on his own, doing his own thing. But we're here today to have a data trialogue. And it might turn into a
song and dance routine?
Yep. But we're also going to take some questions throughout. So we've got about 35 minutes, and we've got to manage that time pretty closely. But if you in the audience have some questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we'll have some mics wandering around to, so everybody can hear that question. But basically, we're just going to talk about data. And since we haven't really had a chance to sit down and discuss this, I think probably the best place to start is maybe Craig, if you could speak about what's the good, the bad, the ugly, what you've seen, and how that's impacting your role today at Newmont Mining.
Hang on. I think we should set some expectations for folks here.
Oh, okay.
So for those of you who may not know, we're going to do a little thing in a minute, but anybody who have seen any of the curling that goes on in the world, there's a little thing that the Norwegian curling team does at the halftime break during curling games, wherein they drop their pants and then they pull them back up without using their hands. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but first to Craig.
Wow.
Bill's going to lead that.
Tough act to follow there. So, yeah, on the good, the bad, and the indifferent and ugly or whatever, but in regards to master data, I've done 2 implementations. The first implementation that I did, we really took and set standards, set governance, cleansed the data, and then went live. And in that case, that's been a long time, and you felt like, well, when are we ever going to get this in the system? But the go live really went well, and that paid dividends. I'm now currently, my current company made a strategic decision. They said, we're going to go ahead and drive to a schedule, and then we're going to clean the master data afterwards. So I've been about 15 months into it, and we're cleaning up the master data, so you can either do it beforehand or you can do it after you go live. I think there is some benefits of doing it beforehand, but we're getting the same results and getting the governance, setting the standards, and driving it forward. So I think that's a good introductory start anyway.
Excellent. And we chose to use this slide. For those of you that came to the Jumpstart session on Monday night, we thought this would be a good slide to kind of articulate what are the steps that you have to get to, and what are we really trying to achieve with this data once we have it. How do we sustain it? What's the governance? So on and so forth. And Bill, you have a great deal of experience with governance, because one of your big projects of late was to implement the very first instance of that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Norm. I have a lot of experience that goes back for even further than that. I was fortunate enough to set up, some of you who have heard me speak before, I was fortunate enough to set up a master data management and governance group at Suncor Energy at the time that they went live with SAP. So it was, and we've heard some talk today about a lot of these data projects and data initiatives need to have good, strong leadership. And we had that from the top down. Our CEO was like all over that and saying, yeah, we got to do this, we've got to make sure that happens. And so that was kind of my first introduction into master data governance. We tried to do it manually. We tried to do it with people and education of the governance team, but it was still very manual. So about 2 or 3 years ago, Suncor was going through a bit of a, how do we get to the next level with using our SAP? They had just finished bringing another whole oil company into that SAP environment, massive data project, clearly outlined the fact that some of the data wasn't great, and there were disparities between the two systems, obviously, that had to be managed. And the business was saying, yeah, but we can't use this thing. It's not, it gets in the way of everything we're doing. So they launched a very large project to figure out, okay, so what do we have to fix from process perspective, from the data perspective? And one of the things that came out of that was setting up an actual governance model, a governance team, and then implementing SAP MDG for EAM, which is the first ever implementation of that software for EAM. And in total, we put in vendors, MDG for vendors, for material masters, for functional location equipment, and bill of materials.
And what about scale? I think we probably all struggle with, if you've got 100 equipment records or 100 functional locations, what's the right fit for purpose? But what would be the scale in both of your examples? How many records?
From a functional location standpoint, we're a global company and across 4 continents. We have about 600,000 functional locations. Obviously with all the maintenance plans, task lists and all that associated with it, it's a substantial amount of data that needs to be cleaned up. Just to add to that, I think MDG or whatever tool, you need to come up with some tools, and you need to build those standards into the tools and really figure out whatever efficiencies you can to help clean up that data, because it is substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. Suncor, Suncor had to set up a separate instance of SAP to put MDG in because of some a little known feature in the background. And we migrated 400,000 functional locations, about 250,000 equipment records, and then somewhere upwards of 2 million material masters. But be careful, that's the extension to all of the plants, because they're very much trying to make sure that all the same material master is they've got one material master for the same material, regardless of which plant, which warehouse, et cetera, it's in.
So I don't know about you guys, but I'm curious. So out in the audience, more than 100,000 records? Okay. Less than 100,000 records is everybody else? Okay. More than 500,000 records? Okay. So scale is an issue, right? Scale is always an issue. And I think that in my experience dealing with scale, I remember being at DuPont many years ago, and they had a separate instance for master data. It was always a challenge for that scale, right? And I'm a big fan, though, of if you can do it manually on a pilot or a prototype perspective, or even on a smaller scale, get it right. Even if you're going to implement a tool of some kind, you got to get those business rules built somewhere.
Oh, absolutely,
right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I don't know how you feel about managing it manually somewhere to start with, getting that solid, and then implementing a tool set.
That's absolutely right. We basically, because we have 4 regions, we basically have been trying to focus in on one site, one region, and trying to get that right. It's a very iterative, it's a very collaborative process, getting the engagement of the folks in the sites. They want to have input into what we're doing. Again, we have governance that's both at the corporate level for global objects, we have regional governance, and then we have site governance. So, and some of those are more guidelines than standards, but it does scale up, and they do actually appreciate the help. And again, like I said, we have definitely hired third-party help to assist the sites, and I use the term throw it over the wall. We don't want our consultants to work here and then throw it over the wall. We want them to do as much pre-work as we can. We've been utilizing resources from India and everything else to help us out, so when we give it back to the sites basically get the opportunity to validate and confirm versus having to do all the legwork and heavy lifting.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The thing that I was surprised, to tell a little story here. When we first sat down to do the project at Suncor a couple of years ago, one of the things that was involved...
Sorry, I made a face. When you said you're going to tell a little story, I made a face.
That's okay.
But Bill, you've got lots of stories. So
yeah.
I was trying to figure out which story is he going to tell. But go ahead.
It wasn't one about you.
Okay, well, that's
yeah.
good. That's what I was concerned about.
Anyway, so one of the things that they did was, as I said, they set up the governance and all the rest of it. Now you made me lose my train of thought, buddy.
Don't make me tell a story. I told a joke at the beginning. Look how well that went.
I know. Anyway, so What are we talking about?
I don't know. I think we're talking about dropping our pants, weren't we?
Oh, that comes later.
Oh,
Comes
okay.
later. Yeah, I know, governance. Oh,
Maybe
well,
you think about that
I'll
for
think
a
about this. Move on.
Hey, Amit, can I have that chart that's up there on here? Because I can't remember it, and I think it's all screwed up anyway from a formatting perspective, but thank you for that. I think one of the things that we definitely wanted to talk about was the fact that those governance models are going to try to drive that enterprise key. Now, I talked about the enterprise key in the Jumpstart session, and I don't know what the term should be. Should it be indices? Should it be enterprise key? But the governance work that you started to do at Suncor, really, you ran into a problem down the road, right? Because they had to do workarounds with the functional locations the way they were set up, and that ended up being a big ticket item.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that around that, and my thoughts came back, but I'll branch.
Oh, okay. I was trying to help you.
It's okay. I'll branch into it. Okay. Yeah. The thing about so what happened at Suncor is when Suncor was going live with SAP, right in the year leading up to the first go live, they had a massive fire in their upgrading facility up in northern Alberta. Very massive fire. And if anybody's ever worked in the cold climates, and in a petrochemical industry or hydrocarbon industry, you know that you're fighting these fires with water. And water in January at 40 below becomes ice very quickly. So one of the things that they had to do was spend the first 6 weeks chipping ice to get at the facility so they could actually repair it. So the long story short is that that particular part of the business didn't have any opportunity to get involved with the data conversion. And it was being done very manually because it was coming from a whole bunch of different systems. And so it was basically a bunch of smart people in a room going through and building out the functional location structures. Many of the CMSs that they were coming from didn't have any kind of location structure, so they had to make that stuff up. And meanwhile, the upgrading facility isn't playing. They got a couple of guys who are there trying to help, but one's a retiring supervisor and one's an instrument tech. And so they got down to the 11th hour, and they just started hammering stuff into this thing. They got into that, and they started working through the go live. And they started working through process and saying, okay, well, we had a guy beating the drum saying, you got to follow the process, you got to solve the process. We gave you a new process, you got to do it, you got to follow it, no workarounds. And that was great for about 8-9 months. And then this team that was driving that and just driving the process improvement and the standards around managing process, they started getting pushback. And we had planners and schedulers saying, look, I get what it is, and I'm trying to do that, but the data will not let me do it. I'm now not taking any shortcuts. I get to this point, and look, I'm stuck. There's a data problem. And so they had to kind of sit back and go, oh, whoa. Yeah, we do have a problem. And so a large project kicked off, much like what Craig is doing, to clean that up so that you could actually support the business process with the data that was in SAP.
So I guess Norm and Bill, if I was in the audience, I'd probably want to ask a question about SAP as an integrated system. How do you manage that when you're all looking at your own work streams and looking at the integrated pieces and the shared master data? So.
Yeah, that's a good one. So I'm a big fan of communities of practice, special interest groups, technical excellence networks across the organization that bring stakeholders together to discuss those issues and create that integration. Because the system only does what we do to it, right? It only accepts it comes empty, we have to populate it, and so if we aren't really communicating with our peers and maybe even external, so we understand what's happening externally, then that integration falls apart. So I think that a community of practice model, definitely a project team or a team of people that have that awareness is so key to any of these activities, and I suspect you're experiencing that with your project and the scale that it is. So.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think, to add to that, I think thinking about the end in mind where, what operational reporting you're going to be doing, so that'll help drive what data that you need to get out of the system. What is the balance sheet requirements? Those type of items I think are pretty important for looking at it, make sure when we get done with this major cleanup of data, we're going to deliver the product that we need to deliver. and that'll help avoid any kind of a redo.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that's important is it's really tough, and Craig alluded to this, it's really tough. It's real easy, let me back that and swing it around. It's really easy to put in good governance and define or identify the data object owner for vendors, for example, or for customers. It's a lot tougher for us in the EAM space to say who owns the functional location, because most organizations don't have a executive vice president of maintenance. The maintenance stops at the plant management level within each of our facilities. And so one of the things that we came up with at Suncor was, okay, so how do we handle that piece? Because it's real easy to make a director in the supply chain organization the owner of the vendor. But what do we do about the Montreal refinery and the fact that he doesn't really care what functional location looks like in Fort McMurray or in Denver? And so there was this concept of you've got enterprise-wide governance, you also have regional and local governance as well, but it still has to tie up. There still has to be a senior leader who is ultimate throat to choke on that and is guiding and directing and supporting those regional governance leads.
How do we feel about the word ownership? I'm going to challenge that a little bit because I don't really care for it myself.
Okay.
I think we need technical authorities over data. You could be an owner of data. It's like owning a building and then hiring out the management of that building to a management company. As the owner, you've relinquished control of that building to that management company who within the contract has certain parameters as to what they can do with that building. And I think that a technical authority, as we do with our electrical and our instrumentation and our mechanical and our asset integrity groups, they have the ultimate say over how that asset is managed. So I'd like to say we stop using the word owner. We start using the term technical authority over certain elements of data. One other thing.
Okay.
I'd also
You're
like
on a
to,
roll.
I am kind of. I'm standing up, I'm talking, my shirt is probably flashing around. Somebody made a joke, actually, and they'll remain nameless, about how my shirt looks like the state of master data. I kind of take offense to that, actually. I think the integration needs to go farther than just SAP. I think it needs to be the engineering systems that are around SAP. I think we need to really manage that data because from my perspective, we got to get as far left as possible to when that technical tag was created, and then how do we manage it going forward? Okay, so I'm going to hop off my soapbox.
Okay, I'm going to challenge your notion of ownership.
Oh, okay.
And I'm only going to do it this way by saying I don't disagree with most of what you're saying. However, I think that there's
It's better than I expected.
There's at least a few people in the room who will probably stand up and say, yeah, but we got to have an owner because there's a regulatory body that is coming after somebody if there is a problem. And so that's the only reason that I tend to think that. So you've got compliance assets. I guarantee you that there is a senior person who says, I need to know that we're doing our inspections and we're doing all the follow-up on that.
But doesn't the senior VP sign off on the owner user program and then the chief inspector is the technical authority over that? So who's going to, right? Yeah. That's just the model I'm trying to.
No, that's fair. Okay. I do agree, however, with the whole concept of getting as far upstream in the either both in the new asset build-outs as well as in the acquisitions. There's far too much of this back the dump truck up to the door, dump a whole lot of manuals off and say, here, hopefully you can get this into SAP. But I've also seen it backfire. I actually, before I retired from Suncor, I gave one of the senior engineering managers a real hard time because they had gone out and rather than they wanted the Suncor material masters in to come back from the EPC and be on all of their P&IDs, all their drawings. But what they did was they handed the EPC, they handed them the piping specification and not the catalog. So what did the EPC do? They simply attached all of their own numbers to it. They say, these are our item numbers. And then when Suncor said, yeah, but you got to give us our numbers. And they said, oh yeah, sure, not a problem. You write the check, we'll match them up with our numbers.
So that's indexes to information.
Yeah, you've got to get that. You've got to figure out that one. And sometimes as companies, we got to force feed our partners in the building of this stuff to get that back.
Yep.
So, Bill, I think I'd be interested also, since you went through a major implementation, what kind of training did you give the people that were responsible for the governance?
There was a couple of parts to that. First of all, implementing the MDG tool, the governance is now, the governance of the actual creating of new data or the maintaining of existing data or the retiring of existing data is, the rules are all baked into the tool, and so you don't have a whole lot to do there. However, and so what was really important or had to be done was setting up this governance organization and identifying the stewards within the central support group who were going to be monitoring data quality and all that sort of stuff. And so it was a smaller group of people that needed to be trained, other than, of course, training on the actual tool that we rolled out. And most of the people that were in that governance organization were already on the central master data team, so they didn't need a whole lot of training about data and data governance. They were already doing it. They were now just their roles changed to support the tools, the rules in the tools, etc., and the user community using the MDG tool.
Okay.
That's kind of to your point about the project team evolved with the project and became the sustainment team after the fact.
Yep.
Yeah. Makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and not only, the sustaining piece of it, at least from our standpoint, is we're absolutely doing the training, but we're also building playbooks to keep that sustainability going after the project's basically completed.
Right.
So.
Right. Okay, we're about a little over halfway through. Are there any questions in the audience that someone's dying to ask? If you could raise your hand if you've got a question. If not, we can carry on. I don't see any hands, but I can't really see past the first row. So,
You're not used to being on stage under the lights, are you?
Joe, have you got a question? Just one sec. Let's grab the mic here so everybody can hear you.
Have you remembered your story?
Yes, I have, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I didn't want to go back there, but now that you've asked, we'll go.
Are you trying to make me forget it again? So when we started this, the MDG and the data governance piece of work, having been the guy who led the Central Master Data Management, Master Data Governance team, I was really confident that the data was in pretty good shape. I'd been gone for a year or so, but I was really confident. There was a whole lot of really competent people who understood their marching orders, who had full suites of guidelines and structure that they followed. And having been with worked with these people day after day after day, I knew what they did, and I knew the questions they would ask me on a daily basis and ask their team leads. So I was really confident. So then standards are developed. Admittedly, the standards didn't necessarily reflect what was being done by the governance team, but that's another story. However, even things that I thought were really in good shape and were in the standard, when we profiled the data, it wasn't really as good and clean as I thought it was. And so one of the, because you get, and so I was really surprised at that. And one of the reasons that we had ended up with the MDG tool is because around the Material Master, we had got to the point where we were keeping about 20 or 25 lookup lists in an Excel spreadsheet to give drop-down lists to people filling them out, and every single one of those values was in SAP. And so it made a whole lot of sense. And for those who don't know, the beauty of SAP's MDG tool is that it is just part of your SAP today. You all have it. You may not have it licensed, you may not have it turned on, but you all have it in ECC. It's just another piece of it. And because it's there, when you want to go and look up a unit of measure, you don't have to build a list for that. It goes to the unit measure table and says, here's the units measure.
I think if there's no question, just to continue on, I think you added another element that I've heard throughout some of the presentations, and that's quality assurance. Mm-hmm. And actually measuring and auditing and continuing to have some kind of a process there so everyone knows that that's going on in the background and bringing value back to the organization and not skewing off, and then 2 years from now you start figuring out you got a problem, right?
Yeah, and there are some good tools out there as well, but I mean, you can do it any way you want. want. But I think fundamentally if you're doing a data project, personally I believe a couple of things. One is, if you're going to do a data cleansing project, you better put in governance. And if you're going to have good governance, you have to be measuring that, so you got to do data quality reporting against the same rules that you're using for your governance.
Which shouldn't really be a surprise, because that's how the operations work, right? They get audited so often by regulatory bodies or by internal bodies. Those improvements that come out of those audits really drive the next degree of change. And yet we've been slow, I think, as a community to adopt auditing of our data against our standards, which I hope contain the minimum requirements and the quality expectations of that data. And really that's all that standard has to contain, right?
Yep.
And we just have to then go out and come back with results of an audit and produce a result. And typically that's the speak that VPs and executives understand. Oh, we've done some type of audit or an assessment and there's a improvement required, and then they kind of get that because they're used to it. But I don't know that we do enough of that.
I would agree. I would agree.
Who audits their data today? Okay, a very small handful of people. So after this conference, who's going to go back and start to audit their data?
I will
Maybe
ask
more?
a corollary question, and who has the standards or the guidelines and the rules that they could actually do it today? Or is this tribal knowledge that people are doing this? Because one of the things we found out as part of this large Suncor project was there was 6,000 people who could maintain an equipment record. There's only 15,000 people in the company. One out of every 3 people could go in and change an equipment record.
So I think it still asking questions out there, so let us know if you have a question, but just to build on that.
Peggy has one.
Peggy has a question. Where's the mic? Here it comes.
Since you asked, one of the biggest issues that we constantly struggle with at my company is, when do you decide that you're at the lowest level of detail for creating something as an equipment record, and when do you decide that no, you shouldn't itemize that as equipment in SAP, it should just be components and parts of that equipment? That's one that we struggle with a lot of time, because one engineer or one plant will want very much detailed levels going down to the individual instruments and components within their pumps, and somebody else says, no, just saying that I have a pump is good enough.
So I'm going to jump on that one first.
I wanted to.
Then do it.
No, it's okay.
When I was involved in putting in in SAP in 2004 and 5, one of the things that we sat down in our workshops with the business is they asked the same question. And so we came up with a term we called maintenance significant. And what that basically meant, and then we wrote some rules around, okay, well, let's define that, because it wasn't clear. It was clear to some of us who live and breathe this stuff, but it wasn't clear to everybody what maintenance significance was. So essentially what it really boiled down to is, if you need to know the discrete history on a piece of equipment as compared to its brother or sister that has a different serial number, and if you want to know where that thing has lived within your plant because it moves around, then that's a really good time to be making that an equipment record. Otherwise, if you don't care, don't bother. Craig and I actually had an interesting conversation around heavy equipment, because in one of the sessions somebody said, "Yeah, we don't have equipment for our fleet. It only goes down to the functionation level." And as a fleet maintenance guy, I struggled with that concept of, okay, don't I want to know which hydraulic pump came out and which one is in there now, and how many times I've had to repair that sort of thing. So to answer your question, Peggy, that's kind of the rules that we followed anyway. I don't know whether you have any similar experience.
A couple things, right? We if the part should be on a task list or in a bill of material, then we consider it a part, right? In regards to trying to keep as standard as possible, we utilize reference functional locations so that the sites would utilize those, and that way it kept it pretty standard. And with those were, we had governance on those by 3 of the 4 regions have to approve a change or a new reference functional location. So that's a little bit of what we've put in place.
And you had a thought.
Oh, I have a thought. I'm going to get back up on my soapbox. I think it's like this. I think it's history, location, cost, or state. If you can answer yes to any one of those, it should go into SAP. Now, I fully believe that that's the breadth conversation. So I would like to also say that I would put every tag, everything, every chair, desk, computer, whatever in, because exceptions to the rule create confusion. So as soon as somebody goes into the system and tries to create a notification and there's no equipment record, there's no functional location, what do? They blame SAP, right? When really it was probably a decision that was made in 2004, right? So I recognize that it costs something to do that, but it costs something for that individual or those many individuals that can't find their technical tag and they get frustrated. So weigh the costs, but I think it's simple: history, location, cost, or state. And I always have the conversation about ladders and fire extinguishers and goofy things like that, right? But it never changes. It just changes based on opinions. So if you do set up some sort of a mechanism, maintenance significant definition, and a little decision tree, get some agreement on it, and then away you go. And be prepared to, hopefully that's your minimum requirement, and you add to it. Non-process equipment, you maybe do slightly different. How do you handle your torque wrenches and your calibration tools and all the stuff that's out there as well that you should probably track? Do you want somebody using a spreadsheet? I don't. I want them using SAP. Most of us, I think, still only use about that much of SAP functionality, right? So let's get at it. There, I'll get off again.
It's a good soapbox. I had a question. It's kind of building on yours. When we put governance in, is it probably a good time to review our security and the roles and access? So I don't know if you might have some comments on that. It sounds like you discovered this. Did you take action?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we discovered, and to be honest, what had actually happened was that there was an obscure reliability management role that had one transaction code in it that we had not originally put in the security model. And suddenly, as the business evolved in using SAP, they needed this thing. And so the security team just kept issuing this thing out. Most of the people most of the 6,000 people that had the ability to change an equipment didn't know they had it. They were using a totally different transaction. But yes, as part of that whole thing, there was a whole look at what does the security look like, and what do we need to rip out, and it's not the worst case I've seen. When I worked for Canadian Pacific Railway, when I first got there, I started asking some questions. I'd been brought in to deal with master data and master data governance, and I started asking some questions. I fell off my chair. Canadian Pacific had 300 people who could create a cost center.
We should probably say a not-to-be-named railroad in Canada.
What?
I don't know, because they're not here to defend themselves, for one.
But I'm not saying anything that wasn't true. Okay, a not-to-be-named railway in Canada that is not Canadian national.
Right. It's much clearer now, yeah.
Okay.
I think security is a big issue. I'm constantly met with that battle about who should be able to do that and who shouldn't be able to do that. I think the governance model that you build has to include that security. Again, back to who are the stakeholders that you talk to when you build out that governance. The next piece of that I'll lead into here. We've only got a couple minutes left, but I get really frustrated when IT won't let the business manage their own data. And I'm a big proponent of LSMW and data loads in that fashion, and I constantly hear that, oh, I'm in the business, I can't run LSMW. But I'm in the business and I can hire 50 monkeys and infinite number of typewriters, and I can do the same thing, just takes longer.
So not to sound like an MDG zealot, but
we only get 2 minutes, Bill.
You don't need it anymore. The beauty of the MDG tool is you've got some mass load functionality that still runs through your governance, because the problem with LSMW is you've got to run the governance on it before you create your load file, because otherwise you're just going to load bad data. The MDG tool allows you to do do the same sort of things. It still runs it through the governance there. You can have a single change request that has multiple records of data in it, and it takes care of that very nicely. And the beauty of it as well is that if you build your roles properly, and you build your workflows properly, then if you have 6,000 people who need to be able to change an equipment master, you can still give that to them, but you're just giving them a different way of doing it. You're applying the governance, and away you go.
Yep. Okay, thank you. I think clearly we talked a lot about governance, so we've got 1 minute left. Any questions before we move on? There's a question way in the back, so I need somebody with a mic to run. No, that's why we have a mic.
Okay, I have two questions. First is, of all of your organizations, do any of you use a chief data officer? And if so, what is his responsibilities as it relates to information governance? The second question is, how many of you use information steward?
You go first.
Okay, we do not have a chief data officer. We basically, each work stream has a owner, regional owner for the business, and I guess in final approval, me and my role as a global role have kind of the final say on the standards and that. In regards to InfoSteward, we haven't deployed that yet. We're looking at the potential there. We have other, what do you want to call it, tools and options going at this point.
Suncor, we deployed both Information Steward and we were using data services as part of the whole cleansing and data migration tool, but we also built some advanced queries against data in data services, and then leveraged those with BI to be able to do some nice dashboarding. Part of that was because the way the rules were built, they were fairly enterprise-wide, yet regionally somebody wanted to see how well their particular part of the business was doing, and that was a little harder to set up in the InfoSteward tool. So.
And from my perspective, many companies I've seen use Information Steward. It's a maturity question, I think, in some cases. Chief Data Officer, haven't had the pleasure of working with one of those yet.
Oh, me neither.
I'd love to have that conversation over tequila, maybe, later on. So I think it's a good topic to talk about for sure. The community could benefit from those positions. So guys, we're out of time, and we didn't drop our pants, so it's been a success.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, you guys. I hope that everyone out in the audience was enlightened by something we talked about, so thank you very much, you guys.